Thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Gender Dignity, Unique and Equal. I thank you for your time and your interest. Tonight, we are tackling a real difficult topic. We're going to tackle addictions. Talk a little bit about different treatment options for addictions and why we want to do this. Well, let me give you some very startling statistics. Last year, in 2015 in Maine, there were 276 known deaths. We don't have any data, of course, on unknown deaths. Addiction affects 26 million Americans, that again we know of, which affects 10% of the population. Why is it important on this show? Well, the LGB part of the population suffers 30% from addictions, and transgender people and gender non-conforming people suffer at a rate of about 60%. Large part of that is due to the isolation and the stigma and the loneliness that comes with addiction and comes with being in a marginalized population. According to the Harvard School of Public Health, they feel, the average American, 82% of us feel that this is a problem that is worse than cancer and diabetes. It's costing millions and millions and millions of dollars, and I think when we're thinking about that, we tend to think just about the legal consequences, not even considering and factoring in people's potential and how that impacts us as a society as a whole. Another reason, half of all the violent crimes that are committed by people who are under the influence of a hard drug or substance or alcohol. 2/3 of all child abuse is also committed while under the influence. So obviously this is disconcerting. It's a huge issue, and in Maine in particular, we're leading the nation in heroin epidemic. New England seems to be particularly susceptible, with New Hampshire being a close second. So tonight we have two guests. They're going to share their personal and professional experience with addictions and with treatment modalities. And in the spirit of the program, I'm going to introduce them. They're going to introduce themselves. So without further ado, you see this is a serious problem, and we're just going to launch in and see where this discussion goes. Thanks again for watching. Mike, we're going to start with you. And so I would like, viewers are really used to you introducing yourself, and when you do that, I'd like you to use language that feels safe to you, only disclose what feels comfortable to you, and would you mind just sort of introducing yourself to viewers, any professional, personal credits you want to include, and if you're comfortable, a transition story or coming out story, or none at all.
Okay.
So.
Well, my name's Mike Blanchard, and I'm a recovering drunken junkie. That's the short version.
Okay.
And my my connection to LGBT issues is that I always knew that I was gay. I always knew before I had a word for it.
Okay.
I knew what it was, and I picked up booze very early in my home. It was available, it was accessible, and so I utilized it. Even. And I have memories as young as 6 or 7 years old.
That you started to drink?
Oh,
wow.
Finding alcohol, knowing where it was in the house, you know, seeing that other people were using it and that there was some sort of an effect there. And a lot of what I'm telling you is hindsight based on my experience in recovery, not insight at the time. But, you know, to be so young, to know that I was gay, to not have a word for that, and to want to just, to inherently know that that was wrong. Growing up in a heteronormative society, to just know on some level that I was hugely faulted from within. Alcohol, mimicking other folks around me, what alcohol did was it made all that all right. And it
they were modeling that for you.
Yeah, and not so much that folks were modeling it for me, but drinking, you know, in the late 60s and early 70s, there was conviviality, there were social aspects to it, there were people getting along. It looked like folks were just really, to me, someone who felt totally disconnected. They were connected, and I desperately wanted that, and so I would sneak a little bit of everything into a little glass. I'm dating myself, but into a little glass Skippy peanut butter jar and bring it out into the woods and drink it. And felt that moment. And later on in life, I was someone who was bullied early on in elementary school, and I think it's almost intrinsic that folks use the worst language, and folks my age, were using terms like fairy and queer and fag and chasing me home from school, and I wasn't much of someone who wanted to fight. I got into junior high school. In high school, I found swimming. I became a little more athletic, a little bigger, a little stronger, and also saw that alcohol and drugs were something that could enhance my social skills. So it went from something very personal that I internalized into something very external.
Can you explain a little bit how you felt that enhanced your social skills? Was it just...
It made me, in my mind, again in hindsight, it made me more masculine. It made me more one of the guys.
Okay.
It definitely, my name started getting said over the announcements in the morning. Mike Blanchard has set a school record in the 50-yard backstroke or the 100-yard backstroke. And so I was getting some acknowledgement from, guys for having that athletic prowess, and actually kind of turned it on its ear a little bit to where I was now the one who, there aren't a lot of people that would say, oh, Mike Blanchard, the bully from high school, but there are 3 or 4 guys that really remember me as someone who bullied other folks with that same hateful language. And to speed it up a little bit, I ended up at 27 years old after, several attempts at recovery at the, what was then the Westbrook Hospital detox, and from there I went into a program called Smith House, which was a day treatment. I think they call it intensive outpatient now, and moved into Serenity House and learned how to live clean and sober one day at a time. And part of my job in all of that was to help others. And as I came out and got more comfortable with myself around my sexuality, I knew that I also needed to try and help others. In relation to that struggle. So not only the struggle with addiction piece, but the specific struggle with trying to find out who and what Mike is, and discarding a lot of the stuff that I threw on top of that, including alcohol and drugs.
Now, were you drinking the entire time from 6 all through this?
It varied. I don't believe that there were a lot of There were not a lot of drinking episodes when I was 6 or 7 or 9 or 10, but once I got into junior high and saw that there was a certain social aspect, some of my peers were drinking and getting high, and at that same time I was being, in my mind, elevated because I had something athletic that I could do. I had something that, in my mind, made me more masculine, more assertive, more out there and connected to the world. And I saw that this was something that I could use to further connect. So I started getting drunk and high, and I've since worked with 12, 13, 14-year-old children. And just seeing that, just how young I was at that time, and I was already experimenting, and it was already getting in the way of my life. It was getting in the way of my studies. It was, drinking and drugging was affecting me in a negative way as early as 14, 15 years old.
Sure. Yes, it would stunt your learning and...
Absolutely, and it made all that other stuff that I was trying to suppress comfortable.
A lot easier.
I would date girls. I would go to the dances. We used to call them hops then.
Okay.
And you sound like you remember that too.
Not at all.
Okay. Well, long after, I'm sure you had them after me. But I started doing what I saw my peers doing. I would go roller skating. I would pursue and chase girls like my friends did.
Liquid courage.
Exactly,
Yes,
exactly. And some of that was definitely, it had that foothold in using a substance to be able to step out of myself and do what I thought was really, it was just not my thing. It was something that made me ill, but the booze and the drugs made it okay to pursue that and to do something and be something other than I was.
Now, when you came out, did this? How did your recovery take? You know what I mean? Coming out being a relief, or how was that?
Well, it was really twofold. I got outed in 1983, and I look back on that time and the folks that were involved in that much differently now at 54 than I did at that time. At that time, I was absolutely terrified.
Sure.
And again, I relied on substances. I sought out, because I toyed with coming out, and then Charlie Howard was beaten and thrown off a bridge in Bangor, Maine, and he and I would be about the same age, and hearing the rhetoric around that from my peers. I was out of high school now, but hearing the rhetoric around that, I was terrified, having been outed, and seeing what had happened, 2 hours away from my home.
Oh, absolutely.
I sought a solution in selling. I went from just purchasing drugs and alcohol to selling it, because in my mind I didn't think anybody would knock over a dealer.
Oh, gotcha.
And I did it to protect myself. And later on, when I got into treatment and I talked about that, I talked about it from a standpoint of addiction. And there were some very compassionate counselors that said, you did that because you needed to survive. You didn't do that because of your alcoholism. Let's separate that piece out.
Okay.
I'm really grateful that 26, 27 years ago, I was receiving effectual, supportive treatment around not only my addiction, but around my sexuality from individuals. Society hadn't changed locally like it has since then. It's evolved. But at the time, individually, from a counseling level and from other folks who were in recovery, I received some tremendous support.
Wonderful. And one thing that stands out to me in 1983 really was only a decade after it had gotten off the books as a mental illness.
Absolutely.
And I think that's quite relevant, so that's very courageous, Mike. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
And Steve, really the same question. If you would just introduce yourself to viewers in language that feels safe at your comfort level.
Thanks. Sure. Steve Addario. I'm all kinds of things. I usually introduce myself as a clinical social worker, a coach, a professional coach. That's my professional world. I have not. I've been very fortunate not to have the addiction to alcohol and drugs, although I'll tell you, I spent a lot of years using alcohol and drugs. It's amazing. I think I'm very fortunate that I never went past that edge.
Right.
Some people can use and really use drugs and alcohol and not get addicted, and I was lucky there, but I'm addicted to everything else.
Okay. Yes.
And 13 years ago, I joined another 12-step program, a food addiction program.
Okay.
And I've struggled with my weight for all of my life, most of my life, and it wasn't until I actually started to get my food under control that my life started actually to sort of right itself, because along with addiction comes a lot of behaviors which are based in the shame, which are based in fear, which are based in difficulty with dealing with emotions.
Yes.
Don't know how to, I'm feeling sad, I don't know what to do with that. I'm feeling angry, I don't know what to do with that.
Right.
I'm feeling happy, oh my God, how can I hold on to that?
Sure.
All that challenge of dealing with emotions. And so getting into this 12-step program has actually helped me get a lot of that stuff in order and put things in place. So there's the professional clinical background and the coaching work that I do. Some known experience as an addict. I come from a family of addicts. I've lived around addiction throughout my life. and then all kinds of other things. I was an art teacher. I was a cake decorator. A lot of things that I've done in my life that have been really fun and interesting. And the interesting piece of that is I have a lot of skill, a lot of natural ability, artistic in one way, in part of that, and in the midst of my addiction, I was unable to hold on to any of that. I was unable to actually be who I was. So the addiction sucked the joy out of my life.
Absolutely.
And I share that only because I think it's so important. It's so important that, first of all, addiction, as you said, I think you said 26.5 million people. Yes. Some statistics I've read are up to 40 million people.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
In the world. Only 10% of that population actually seeks treatment. So there are a lot of, if it's 40 million people, 36 million people aren't seeking treatment.
Sure.
And of course, I'm sure we'll talk more about it. There are varying ways of treatment.
Sure.
There's just not one way that works for everyone.
And also to point out, I was talking about harder substances, but you make a great point. I mean, there are food addictions. We have nicotine addictions.
Right.
Sugar is the biggest addiction actually on the planet.
Right.
And food in particular, I think a very difficult one because you have to eat. You don't have to drink, you don't have to smoke, you do have to eat. So I think that we struggle with addictions in a myriad of ways that
Absolutely.
So
sex,
thank you
gambling,
for sex. Gambling is one of the number one.
Other people.
Yes.
Love addictions.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. It impacts everything. And,
yes.
And my understanding, probably more from a clinical perspective, is that it is what I said is some people we live in invalidating environments. Yes. You were bullied. People have different experiences, but whatever it is, I actually know from my own personal experience at 9 years old, my family would have large groups of people together, and especially in the summer, everybody would get together. Families would come together, and we'd rent a cottage together, and so people were bunking together. And I remember being 9 years old, and some guy and a teenage, sort of young adult, climbed into the bed with me, and I remember sliding to the wall to be away so that I didn't touch him, because I was also aware of that I had a very different sense of men. I knew that there was something wrong with me, so that's the other piece I didn't share. I'm a gay man, and at 9 years old, I knew that there was something different, but I interpreted it as being there's something wrong.
Right.
With
What's
me.
wrong with me? No.
And so there is that piece that's an overlay. Your statistics about how impactful it is to the LGBT community is tremendous, because there's all that other additional layer of problems and difficulty. And I guess the other important thing to say is that the good news, two bits of good news. One that you raise is that society has changed, or is changing as we speak, but has changed tremendously since I was a kid. And then the other piece of that is that there is hope, there is recovery, and our skills, our tools are getting better all the time. And more people can get helped. And it's not easy. But there's help, and people can find recovery in so many varying ways.
Yes. Thank you, Steve. That's very brave. And we're going to launch into a little bit of the second question, because I think the way we view addiction, the causes, the theories behind it, gives rise to how you're going to get treatment, if you're going to get treatment. If it's too stigmatizing, you're not going to want to. And that's an issue. So my second question is really interesting, and I'm going to start with Steve, and then we'll go to Mike. Would you share your views about the causes of addiction, in your opinion, professional, personal, and any theories that you have behind it. I kind of got a glimpse of, I know in America we tend to think of things as being a chemical imbalance, or addiction as a disease, the disease model. I'm not taking a position either way. A lot of research, though, that I've come up against, I found interesting I'm trying to think of that professor. There was a professor, Bruce Alexander from Vancouver. He did a study with rats, and you might be familiar with it, where he had rats in isolation, and they had water, and then they had cocaine water, and the rats repetitively went to the cocaine water. And then he built a great rat park, and the rats had lots of sex, and they had all kinds of community connections and lots of fun, interesting things to do, and these rats did not want the cocaine water. And then he made a point, I guess, that Vietnam vets who were returning home, who about 20%, I guess, had serious heroin addictions. But what he found was that 95% of them just sort of kind of gave up these addictions without any professional supports. And so he thought that it wasn't maybe a disease in the way we tend to think of it. Chemical imbalance. He thinks it's a disease of society, that it's a lack of bonding with each other. And so I'm kind of curious, maybe your thoughts on that, if you want to go there.
Sure. I'll have to say, I'm no expert. I have.
Neither am I.
I have clinical skills and I've studied, et cetera.
Sure.
But I'm not the expert. But I certainly have opinions.
Sure.
Addictions, in my view, I shouldn't say my view because it's stuff that I've read and learned, and I believe, I support that addiction comes from a variety of places, and I think I said it earlier that some people can use. I use I use pills. I use pot. I use cocaine. I use alcohol. I used a lot of alcohol. But I didn't become addicted to it.
Cross the threshold. Okay.
But I clearly have what they refer to as an addictive personality. I can easily become addicted. I have a family history, long family history, extensive family history of alcoholism on both my paternal and maternal sides. So genetics plays a large part in addiction. So the disease model, the idea that your body, your brain responds or reacts, I think there's some validity to that. Okay. I also think that there are certain people, I've heard it said that if you use something long enough, most everyone, and I don't know the numbers, but that the more a person uses something for an extended period of time, the more potential there is for addiction. Yep. And then there's the interpersonal piece that you're talking about, the sort of the disease of society, which is, in my view, is, as I mentioned again, the emotions. Particularly if we learn to use alcohol at an early age. The earlier we learn to use alcohol to deal with our fear, to deal with our worry, to deal with our lack of surety, feeling different, being bullied, on and on and on. The earlier that we do that, the more likely it is going to be that we don't have skills in dealing with our feelings.
And kind of hijack your brain too, I would think it would cause different pathways in the brain, or atrophy some even. I would think medicine would do that. So, I mean.
Yeah, it definitely, you're right, it's a drug, it's a chemical, it has some impact, and you mentioned sugar. Sugar has an impact. Sugar has an extreme impact on me. I haven't had sugar in 13 years, and it was because I could watch my emotions go up a moment after I ate sugar and then crash, and my emotional stability was really unpredictable, from rage to depression.
Can I interject something I do know about sugar? It does the same thing to your brain as crack cocaine.
Yeah.
It's the same. Yeah.
same part of the brain
Yep.
is stimulated.
Sure.
It's the pleasure center of the brain, and it is that powerful. Yeah.
Another thing that just occurred to me, and it just occurred to me actually as you were talking, is that I don't think there is, I think there is a lot of merit in calling it a disease too, and part of the stigma. It doesn't blame the person. It sort of, I don't want to say allows, like it allows the person to be off the hook, but to look at a person with more compassion.
Yeah.
If we see it as a disease rather than a moral defect or a character flaw.
Right.
You know, and so that does occur to me that that would make it very useful, even if it weren't true. I'm not saying whether it is or not. I'm just saying that we have a tendency, I believe, in our society to want to blame,
Yeah.
and that kind of puts that out of it, takes that equation out of it, and puts it as a disease, to not as a sort of a different entity in some ways, but makes it a little less burdensome on the person, I would think.
Yeah, it becomes, it's not a moral issue.
It isn't.
You know,
Yes.
you're not an evil person, you're not a
Right.
weak-willed person.
Right.
You know, I mean, you've heard it, we've all heard it. Oh, that person's a nice person, but drinks too much. And
Yeah.
if he would only stop drinking,
Right.
you know, I don't know what's wrong with him. Why can't he stop drinking? Why doesn't he stop? He knows it's hurting his
Right.
family, on and on and on.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that is certainly the reaction.
Yeah.
But the reality is there is a reason that the
Yes.
person is not stopping
Right.
drinking. It's the brain,
Yep.
it's that pleasure center that is saying,
Lighten
give
right
me
up.
more.
Yep.
And when you aren't giving it more, it screams. And you know, also earlier in the recovery process, drugs also have a withdrawal impact, meaning
Yes.
that your body becomes dependent, not just your pleasure center of your brain, but your body becomes physically dependent
Sure,
on it.
sure.
So when you take it away, your body feels pain,
Yep.
discomfort, and so that makes it even more difficult to stop.
Absolutely.
You know, it's very complicated.
Yep.
But again, you know, with the right help, with the right supports,
Mm-hmm.
and with finding ways to replace the drug or whatever the substance is, to replace that and find other tools to be able to deal with life's issues. So when I get sad, my brain no longer has to go down that path of I'm sad. I'm always sad. I'm always going to be sad. It will never get any better. I might as well drink. And that's only one emotion, you know. And there are so many other emotions that we deal with that bring us down that same kind of path, and we have no skills, no tools, because we've found a way that works really fast.
It's a habit.
Yeah.
We do what we know. We do what we practice.
Yeah.
So, and I guess I'm going to ask you kind of the same question. What are your theories behind addictions?
You know, my first thought is that, and particularly like most recently, there's a heroin epidemic, and you know, the question of whether it's nurture or it's nature.
It's both.
You know, and my response is heroin doesn't care.
Right.
Heroin does not discriminate. Heroin eats up and spits out lives. And that being said, I think there are some social constructs that play into the stigma as well. For me personally, when I look at the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and you know, and I look at the heroin epidemic today, and it's affecting white, middle to upper class families.
Spectrum.
And so the level of empathy and the level of this being about a disease from a standpoint of destigmatization is much different than what I was bombarded with from a standpoint of the crack epidemic, which was, you know, the buzzwords, inner city.
Yes. It was those other people.
It was those other people, and it was not a problem that there was a lot deeper moral value judgment connected to that, in my opinion. And so sometimes you know, when we talk about booze and we talk about, there are still Irish jokes about and Native American jokes about booze, and the fact of the matter is that this country used alcohol to rule over the people of the nations, because they saw that these folks processed alcohol differently and had a much different reaction than the white invaders. And with that was handed down this lower moral value judgment about not being able to handle alcohol. And so people can debate the merits of what I'm saying. I just believe that talking about addiction devoid of a social construct takes away from the discussion. And I know for me, I really believe that I am an alcoholic and a drug addict. I believe that one is too many and 1,000's not enough. I believe I'm bodily and mentally different than other folks. And I also believe that if I pick up a drink, God forbid, if I picked up a drink or a drug today, you'd hear about it on the news by the end of the week, because it wouldn't be as if I wouldn't pick up where I left off. I would pick up like I had never stopped. And I've seen this time and time again, working in the recovery field, working with other folks in recovery. I've seen where folks that relapse don't pick up where they left off. They pick up as if they had never stopped.
And then their body,
exactly, their body reacts in a way that's different than most folks. That being said, I also know there are folks that I drank with in high school and right after high school that I partied with and that I did all that stuff with, and they stopped drinking like I did. They went on and married and had families. They had connections, as I know you talk about and are really invested in, and I believe in too. I don't believe the connection necessarily has to be, well, you're in treatment now. Here's a 12-step program that fits you. Now go do that, and you'll get all better. For some folks that works really, really well. For some folks, that's not the connection. And I think that it doesn't matter so much as what's it doing to an individual's life. How is it landing on that person? And I reference another friend of mine who quit drinking on September 11th, 2001. And the reason that they quit drinking was they went and got their children out of school, brought them home, had everybody in the house, and then decided they were going to get good and loaded. And in that moment said, I can't do this right now, my family needs me. And that was the last day that they had a drink. This person and I are very close, and we've talked about that since. We've shared, in retrospect, he's gained some insights in his sobriety, just like I've gained some insights in mine. And one of the things I said to him was, I found myself drinking without my permission. And his response was, I've never done that. I've never, like I would say, I'm going to have 2 beers. The swan song. I'm going to have 2 beers, and end up, coming home and the birds were singing and I had to be to work in an hour, and oh my God. He had never done that. He knew whether he was going to have 2 beers or whether he was going to have 8 beers. And he always made a conscious decision when he got lit. He was a heavy drinker, and ultimately decided that drinking wasn't good for him and that he needed to stop drinking, and he picked up some other things and got involved in some other stuff. Very easily could have ended up sitting in 12-step meetings, bouncing in and out saying, hey, this doesn't work for me. But for him, the difference between he and I was that I get drunk without my own permission. And for him, when he got sober, he felt better. When I get sober, I feel physically better, but emotionally, I feel really bad.
You got to deal with your feelings.
I do not get sober, and I tried several times. I can't tell you how many Mondays I quit drinking, and by Tuesday afternoon, I was like, well, maybe if I just smoke a little bit. And I believe that I'm someone who needed to fill that void and needed to reconcile a lot of that stuff around sex and sexuality, and having no guidance in that area whatsoever was a huge treatment issue for me, because what I ended up doing was exploring sex and sexuality much the way I explored drugs and alcohol, with no supervision, with very little boundaries, putting myself in a position where I was exploited and exploited, and just not knowing any better, and coming to grips with that piece was as daunting and as difficult as actually getting sober.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Can I comment
Absolutely.
on something that you said, that you were coming out and trying to deal with sexuality as well as trying to deal with getting sober, and I mean, it's so interesting. For most of us, for a large part of the population, when you are trying to get sober, I'm talking about the norm, the large norm of the population. You walk down the street, you talk to people at meetings, you go to counselors, etc. Everywhere you go, you talk about things that are normative, that are normal,
right.
quote normal, and that you actually, part of the work of addiction treatment is to remove the shame and to increase honesty and openness and to stop lying. And yet for gay men in particular, because there was such a pressure to be straight or appear straight, that you might be doing treatment. You might be very much involved in treatment, getting all the best help that should be really helpful, except in limited cases, as far as I know. I wasn't in treatment, so I don't know how normal it was, but you end up being in groups and in treatment with treatment providers where you still have to hide a part of yourself.
Sure.
So you still carry this shame.
Yes.
And this fear, and that makes it tremendously hard to actually start to be able to deal with your emotions. Yeah. Because you have to hide.
It comes back to that social construct of addiction too, because it is different for somebody who's LGBT trying to get sober, in the sense that what somebody says in a group setting, even if it's a facilitated group setting, may not land on somebody else well, and they may respond to that in a way that's not the same as if I said, geez, I had a fight with my wife today.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, I really hear you. Boy, I had a fight with my husband today.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. All of a sudden, oh, you're queer.
Yeah, and that energy is in the room, and as recovering, as people who are addicts who really operate from here, because we had to know which door to knock on at 2 a.m. We had to know whether it was safe to go here or drive that way, and so we come into recovery running on this, and we sense that. Microaggression, I think, is a term a lot of people use now, in a group setting, and you're absolutely right. I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to talk.
Absolutely.
And there goes my connection.
Yep.
And thus increases my risk for relapse.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which launches me into my third question. I wanted to talk a little bit, if people are comfortable, with different treatment models, because I know there are a few floating around out there. And before I get to that again, I really did a lot of research in preparation for this, so I want to throw out something I found fascinating. Portugal was really struggling with tremendous addiction, and they didn't know how to deal with it. It was really taking over their society. And so they launched a 2-part program. One, they legalized all drugs, which I think has some use because, maybe safer and destigmatizing. But the other thing they did, they coupled it with a huge program getting people work and microloans and having them reconnect with society, feeling very positive and getting up, they had purpose. And what I'm hearing a lot of is it is, it's about ourselves taking responsibility, but we do live in community, we live in society. And So some people find, AA helpful. Some people, there's another model that I'm becoming a little more familiar with, harm reduction. Someone else told me about a SMART program. I also was reading mindfulness, yoga, mindfulness has really been sweeping and a lot of, not just addictions, but just everything. And it's not easy to be mindful. I think we talk about it. And so I'm going to ask you folks what you felt was helpful for you in terms of community, or if there was a professional model that you feel has been instrumental. And if you don't, just your thoughts on what might be useful for treatment. And Mike, this time we'll start off with you. So.
I'm a whatever works kind of guy.
Yeah.
I really am. Like I said, I think that sometimes. Providers fall into a trap of, you're here, let me assign the 12-step program that fits your need.
One size
now
fits
go forth
all.
and do that, and all will be okay. And then
Right.
when the person comes back, you didn't go to meetings, did you?
Yeah, yeah.
And instead of looking at the whole person and saying, what do you like? What inspires you?
Right.
What delights you?
Yes.
Because what I do personally for me works really, really well for me, but also what I do personally for me may not be the panacea as I see it. And I think that's part of what happens is we see it with a lot of things in society where folks will find something that works and they're like, aha, now we should all do this.
Right. Oh,
and,
yes,
and I
yes,
think that's
sure.
a trap that all of us fall into. And by falling into that trap, we become polarized because we don't want to hear about smart recovery, about rational recovery, about harm reduction stuff, about habit management. I know this is a little off topic, but one of the things I do want to say is I think it's absolutely criminal that for a greater Portland metro area of 100,000 people that there are 18 detox beds. Thank God for Milestone Foundation
Absolutely.
for keeping the doors open
Yes.
and providing that services, but it is absolutely criminal that there are only 18 detox beds
Absolutely.
in an area that serves 100,000 people. That's talk about throwing bricks in the Grand Canyon.
Expand that to the rest of the state too.
Absolutely,
Sure,
absolutely.
right.
Thank you very
Where
much.
people
because
are even
there's
more isolated. Yes,
absolutely
yes.
more isolated, and there are some other treatment facilities up the coast, and I think again a social construct thing because there's that whole north-south piece, and
Yeah.
we've got all the
Yeah.
people. How come we don't have the services?
Yeah.
And other people are saying we're isolated, and how come we don't have the services? And I think both points are really
Sure.
really valid.
Sure.
And I wandered away from the question a little bit, so I'm going to ask
Sure.
for some
I
guidance.
was going to, would you be willing to talk about any treatment modalities, harm reduction, SMART programs, alternatives, anything that you felt worked for you?
Yeah, and I think that there are some things that work for the individual. That one of the things about 12-step programs that I'm not a spokesperson for any 12-step program,
Yeah.
but there are steps and there are also traditions, and some of those traditions directly suggest to people not to break anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. You'll hear people mention it, talk about it, and say, I'm a member of a 12-step program without saying it by name. You'll hear
Sure.
other people who will choose to say it another way. I utilize community supports. I go to meetings. I do this. I do that. My language choice for that is that I have folks in my life that are in recovery that I allow to hold me accountable. For me, that's the crux of what works for me, is that I have folks who I can call, who, when I call and say, oh, I'm really mad at my husband, they'll say, what's your part in it, Mike? I don't want to hear about your husband. What's your part?
Right.
I love you, I care about you, you're my friend, and I honor and respect you, but let's get the focus back on Mike.
Right.
And I think that speaks to one of the aspects of addiction that are, if you were shorter, if you were taller, if you were thinner, if you were fatter, I wouldn't have to feel this way. I wouldn't be so unsettled if the world would just be right. And there's a belief system out there that for the addict or for the alcoholic that we need to take our focus off other people and really put that focus back on ourselves. Now, however somebody does that and however somebody chooses to do that, whether it be with smart recovery, whether it be with rational recovery, whether it be with mindfulness, or for some folks it's just connecting back into the community.
Right.
Some folks stay sober by, serving dinner at a soup kitchen.
Knitting club.
Knitting club, absolutely. They're connected, and there's something in that room. They're getting something out of that. And there are some folks that do it very privately and do it through, individual counseling, and that works for them. I come back to what I said earlier about heroin doesn't discriminate. Heroin doesn't care.
None of it does.
And so, who would I be to say that the method that I personally employ is the only way to get sober,
right,
when there are 300 plus people dying, close to 300 people dying a year from an epidemic, and other substances as well.
Yeah, and the point is, in my mind, to exploring this question is, I don't have addictions per se. Well, I did. I had smoking and sugar also. But it's really to explore a smorgasbord of ideas, because I know for myself, say I was struggling with an addiction, and if I did go to AA and it didn't work for me, and say it doesn't because, there is some evidence that it doesn't work for everybody. And I know myself, and gee, AA is the touted paradigm. I went, it didn't work. There's something wrong with me, and why I want to point out that there are other ways. So if AA is not working for you, there's other ways. And I know, Steve, you know a little bit more about harm reduction. Would you mind telling viewers a bit about that? I'm just learning. I don't know as much about it.
But harm reduction, the premise, as I learned it many years ago, I actually worked about 8 years with the AIDS Project, and that's where I first heard the terminology is harm reduction, because at that point what was being touted was abstinence, and what was happening is the society and culture were saying, in order to prevent HIV infection, you had to be abstinent. You could not have sex. Well, that was really it's true. If you don't have sex, and if you don't have any blood, if you don't get exposure, you're not going to become HIV infected. The problem with the premise is that when you told somebody particularly somebody who might be addicted to sex, that just don't have sex so you don't get HIV infected. Well, you know what? In the moment, when you're feeling that need to have sex, or to use heroin, or to use cocaine, or to use a needle, or to use alcohol, etc. The problem is the abstinence-only idea does not take into account a large percentage of the population. Harm reduction really meant do everything you can to prevent and avoid, in this case, in the HIV infection, to prevent HIV exposure. So use a condom, and use abstinence when you can, various things. And so it's very similar in drug addiction also. It's sort of, if you can reduce the amount of alcohol that you're drinking, if you can control it, that there's a certain percentage. You were talking about variations in treatment. Well, there's variations in treatment. There needs to be variations in treatment, because there's variations in people and how their bodies and their minds and their spirit are able to deal with something. So I might be able to. One person may be able to limit the amount of alcohol that they use. Another person may not. Harm reduction in needle usage, providing clean needles instead of sharing of needles. That makes a big difference in sharing bloodborne diseases, and also it helps to keep the other risk, because the other piece that we haven't talked about with addiction is that it shortens lives.
Yes, it does.
Average of 26 years shorter People's lives become 26 years shorter from the addiction, and also the increase of other diseases that are related. And you talked also about the financial impact of that. It's tremendously expensive.
And an addict doesn't act alone. They have impact at your family, the people who love you. We don't. I remember a professor saying, they're only hurting themselves. Well, tell that to a child who watches, dad or mom, drink herself or himself every night. It's not in isolation. It impacts everyone.
Right.
I didn't realize the impact that I had on, because that was my swan song. Was I'm single.
Yeah.
I'm not hurting anybody.
Right.
And at the same time, I wasn't allowed in my parents' house unsupervised.
Sure.
And when I did get clean and sober and lived in Serenity House, the community that I used to coach in contacted me. Those kids that I worked with at 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, a couple of years had passed, they were in high school, and they reached out to me and said, come to States, come watch us swim. We heard that you're sober. It never occurred to me that my life was impacting theirs in a negative way. It never even registered with me that on some level, what I was offering them, even though I thought I was being a good coach, and I thought that I was being ethical, and I thought that what I was also offering them was the isms. The alcoholism, and the discussions I had with those youth at that time was they were keenly aware
absolutely.
of just how much pain I was in, and internalizing it.
Yep.
And some of those folks I've had conversations with, and sometimes interspersed in my life over the time of my sobriety, I end up having a discussion with yet another person who's now an adult who says, this is what I saw. This is what I saw in you, and it made me sad. And this is what I saw in you, and because thank God they have the skills that they can communicate that stuff. But it reinforces in me, not in a negative way, but it just reinforces in me how deeply this...
It's an act of love.
Yes, it's an act of love. I did want to touch on the harm reduction piece too, because talk about stigmatization. Right. The needle exchange, you're just giving those people excuses to use.
No, you're not.
No, we're keeping them alive and creating another opportunity, or methadone clinics, or habit management. That may not be something I'm choosing to do personally, but it's keeping somebody alive. It's keeping somebody from ripping somebody else off. It's keeping somebody safe. And that stuff is important.
I was thinking of something, now this is interesting. I have a friend I love dearly, and a terrific addict, someone who drank as soon as they woke up until they died. Went to bed and actually said that that's how he wanted to die, is with a beer in his hand. Interestingly enough, would give me some money to put aside so he wouldn't drink too much. Would sometimes give me his marijuana. And now that you're talking about harm reduction, I thought I was being a codependent and didn't want to do that for him, but I did anyway because, I was being a codependent. But now I'm thinking that might have been a form of harm reduction on his part. He was trying to be safe in his own way. If he gives me, $90, he only takes 10, he knew how much he could drink without, would that be an example of harm reduction?
Yeah, it's interesting. As you say that, it reminds me of there's a sort of a cultural belief that it's framed as the pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and there's a strong belief that people need to do that, and I have to say I am probably one of the most responsible people in my circle. I have some very responsible people in my life now, but that's because I've chosen different people. I'm very responsible. I pull myself up by my bootstraps, but there's this underlying belief that if you can't do it, if you can't do it on your own, then you just won't do it. And I really there's an important piece. You were talking about how when people are in treatment, There is a connection that happens. I think that's probably one of the most important pieces. Connection, belonging, feeling like you are part of something, feeling like breaking down that shame piece.
Yes.
So there's a tremendous amount of importance with the supporting someone. Whether that formally fits the term harm reduction, I don't know. It certainly was reducing the harm, though.
It was reducing.
Keep holding back some of the money so that he wouldn't spend it. So it was a protective thing. But a lot of the research that I'm familiar with talks about where the work really needs to happen is in validation. That people get to a place where they can feel like they are a decent, good human being, and they just have a problem that can be dealt with.
And I did want to just add really quickly, the litmus test for that is if it starts being unhealthy for you,
then
if that, then maybe that's something that needs to be reassessed.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this has been a tremendous discussion, and we have to wrap it up, and it's unfortunate. I think we could have talked a good hour more. What I feel that I've learned, and I hope you viewers have learned, that we do live with each other. It isn't just an individual problem. It's a societal problem. There is help out there. If one method is not useful to you, there's nothing wrong with you. It simply means you can try something else. And we touched on some different subjects. We care about you. There's a community out there that you haven't even met yet that cares about you. Your life is invaluable. You may not know that right now, but it is. And I just want to thank you again for tuning in to Gender Dignity, Unique and Equal. If you need help, please get it. It is out there. And don't stop until something works for you. Thank you.